Hey guys, it's Raz. All right, so today is a review of what we're going to go over in class. So when you're watching this, I'm assuming it's a review. So if you want to go grab yourself a cup of tea, get cozy, settle in. Anyways, we'll talk about agriculture and the Green Revolution. So one of the things I want to stress, and something we've talked about in class, is that this is one of those units that there's no like easy, clear cut answer, right? There's pros and cons to every single thing we've talked about, and we will talk about. And the thing that you want to remember is that we have a lot of people on the planet. We have to feed those people. And this is where we're at now. And quite frankly, a lot of what we're talking about, even though there's negatives, are what has enabled our human population to get to where it is and to have us not having people, die from starvation and that sort of thing. So keep that in mind. So most people, when they think of where their food comes from, think about this kind of a thing, right? If you drive up through Western Mass and into Vermont, you see these lovely little small farms, right? And it looks kind of like this. When in reality, we have a much more mechanized agricultural system in this country and in other, most kind of developed parts of the world. It looks different than what we would think of. Okay. And that's partly because of what we call the Green Revolution. So, the Green Revolution was a shift in agriculture away from these kind of smaller family operated farms into basically industrial agribusiness, things that were producing and collecting at a very large rate. In order to do this, we saw a lot more mechanization, right? People physically can't do what we need to do on that scale. So we use machines. We saw the introduction of genetically modified organisms, which we'll talk about in a little bit, increased irrigation practices and kind of how we work on making sure that our crops get what they need, fertilizers and pesticides. Now, again, we increased the efficiency of the lands incredibly with this. It was very profitable in the short term. It rapidly increased our food supply. So this was good for humanity at the time. We saw a lot less world hunger, and Earth's carrying capacity for humans increased pretty dramatically, right? We talked about Malthus, we talked about human population and how there was that Malthusian, like crossing points that was going to be terrible. We never saw that because of the Green Revolution. Now, on the other side of things, there's negatives to all of this. And some of the biggest ones we face with this are things like soil erosion, biodiversity loss, ground and surface water contamination. So, kind of dealing with some of those, which we've touched on in a couple of previous units. Okay, so let's talk about what this means. So, mechanization, right, obviously is the use of more machines. So, tractors and combines and all these kind of things for plowing and tilling and harvesting our food. So, we saw an increased yield. We were able to get a lot more quickly. We had better profits for the people that were, working on these farms. The downside is that there was definitely an increased reliance on fossil fuels, right? These take gas and diesel fuels. So we were contributing a little bit more to climate change. And the machinery is also really heavy. So that heavy machinery, we were seeing soil compaction, which meant that it wasn't holding as much water. And we saw topsoil that was a little bit more prone to erosion. So we started to see some of the soil quality issues along with that. Now we also, this is these high yield variety crops. There's a couple ways we can get high yield variety crops, but basically it just means that they're crops that can produce a lot more food than a typical natural crop. So typically these are hybrids. Now we can do that a couple ways. One of the ways is we can genetically modify them, right, and insert genes from other more productive. The other thing we can do is we can cross pollinate. So we can take different species that have ideal traits, cross pollinate them, and create new offspring. So again, increased yield, more food stability. We were seeing way less famine in food vulnerable regions. So it's a good thing, right? People were living better. Yay. And then again, we got even fancier and we were able to take crops, like I mentioned, had genes from other organisms. We say they're spliced into that genome. So we were kind of cutting and pasting genes. And we were able to create, a whole bunch of plants and crops that were resistant to certain pests, that were resistant to certain things, that were the food they produced stayed riper longer. They needed less nutrients in order to do that. So a whole bunch of things that we were able to create with these processes. I'm actually going to skip these because we're going to talk about these in class. All right. So digging into that GMO, I already mentioned some of the things, right? They can be drought tolerant. I forgot that one. Pest resistance. They can grow faster. So we can actually get crops that reach maturity and reach like food bearing status. I don't know what you call that. My ad kids can maybe help me out with that, but they reach that faster, right? The fruit itself or the grain itself is often bigger, larger, and again, like I mentioned, often stays ripe longer. So again, more profit, yay. We lose fewer plants. So when we plant, we typically get more surviving to actually keep those crops going. That's a good thing, right? And we're getting more yield per acre. We also saw, again, a decrease in loss due to things. So this is actually a picture of BT corn is at the top. It's one of the BT gene is one of the most common that's genetically modified, and it stands for Bacillus thuringiensis. It's a bacteria from soil, and it produces a specific protein that will kill a lot of different corn pests. So what it means is that BT corn, like the one at the top, it basically naturally produces something that keeps insects away. For non-genetically modified crops, we often have to spray with pesticides and that sort of thing. So again, a lot of people think GMOs are like a bad thing and not good. There's been a whole lot of benefit from them. And the protein that bacteria produces, it's not harmful in any way, shape, or form to humans that we can tell. And we've been using this for a lot of years, right? So it's actually making it so that we're not spraying chemicals on the food that we're putting into our body. They're naturally pest resistant. The downfall or the drawback to GMOs is they're typically pretty much genetically identical. So we end up with not a lot of genetic diversity. So if there were something that did get to that crop, it would be devastating. We also run the risk a little bit of some of that getting out into nature and hybridizing with our natural varieties. We've actually found, kind of terrifying, but we found some patented BT corn crops. So we know we're able to identify that that's the specific gene down in Mexico in some of their corn crops. Oops. All right, moving on. The other thing we do with the green revolution is we switched to synthetic fertilizers. And again, we've already talked about this. So we shifted from organic fertilizers to more synthetics, which means that we were better able to get those nutrients back to those plants in a more efficient manner. Sensing a theme here, we saw increased yield and profit. But this is where we end up with that runoff that has high levels of nitrate and phosphate that leads to eutrophication and algae blooms in nearby waterways. The other thing is that in creating those fertilizers, we do use fossil fuels. So there is a slight climate change contribution as well. All right, now irrigation, I'm not going to get into a ton because we're going to talk about the different methods of irrigation in class, but just know that we obviously have to water our crops. So a lot of places we wouldn't naturally be able to grow things. They don't normally get enough rain to support it. So we water them. And it means that we can farm or plant on more acreage than we would be able to naturally. We obviously talked about groundwater supplies and aquifers being a vital resource, and this can sometimes limit that. And if we're not watering the right amount, we can see either overwatering, so we can actually kill the plants because they're not getting the oxygen that the roots need. We basically drown them. And we also see soil salinization, which we're going to touch base on when we do that lab in class. Okay, now pesticides. We also saw an increased use of synthetic pesticides. Now, some of that has been decreased with those genetically modified crops, but we do still spray to kill and keep away certain pests. I don't need to say the benefits again, we get them. Runoff is a concern here. And the other concern is killing non-target species. So a lot of times, we're targeting a specific pest, but insects are pretty closely related. So if it harms one insect, it may harm others. Bees have taken a pretty big hit on this in particular, and other pollinator species as well. So that's a concern. Okay. We also see some of them have like these down the line effects that we don't really think of. We're going to talk a little bit more about this when we get into water pollution. But DDT was a chemical we used pretty regularly in the 60s and 70s. And we found that it actually thinned the shell of bird eggs to a point where they were not able to make it and hatch eggs. So we were seeing eagles, a lot of big birds of prey have some pretty detrimental hits from that. We've also found atrazine, which is another thing we spray on. It's an endocrine disruptor, and it can actually affect amphibians and fish in particular, the sex of them. So they can become intersex, they can change sex. We can find that we have whole populations that are all male or all female. Lots of changes there. So obviously that can throw off that population too. All right, class activity we're going to do. We're going to talk about that in class. So I'm going to stop here. Thanks for sticking with me through this and come on back for the next one.